This video breaks down Netlify's functionality into 4 different stages. The first stage is deploying, and we'll go through a few different methods of deploying, what you get by default, as well as how to set up custom domains. Secondly, we'll talk about how Netlify builds your project and how you can control that with environment variables. Thirdly, we'll talk about local dev and how Netlify helps with your local testing as well as development of your projects. Fourth, we'll talk about how you can add add-ons to your project from anything from forms to identity to serverless functions and all that good stuff. Then we'll end with some troubleshooting tips, as well as where you can learn more about Jamstack, Netlify, all that good stuff. There are a few ways to deploy to Netlify. Netlify Drop is not the most important way, but I find it very useful to explain the history of Netlify as well as the fundamental concept. Netlify started life as a company called BitBalloon, and this is just a simple drag and drop interface where you could deploy your site just by dragging a zip file to this web UI. And so that's the fundamental concept of Netlify, that whatever you can deploy is a static asset. And Netlify is a CDN that just deploys your static assets to all the locations around the world. BitBalloon doesn't exist anymore, so when you type in bitballoon.com, this is what you get. And now it's just called Netlify Drop. Here you can do a simple drag and drop. You can watch the video and learn a little bit more about the functionality. We're going to cover all this in this video. If you don't have a sample site, they even give you a sample site, so you can download this demo. And you can drop it in. And so that immediately deploys. You can click on this URL and see that sample site. This is a publicly available URL that you can share with your friends. So that's Netlify Drop. If you want to, you can unzip this folder and open it up and edit the assets. Here I'm going to edit the assets by going into VS Code, opening a new window, and dragging and dropping this folder. So over here, I can edit the HTML, and I can just say something like, hello, Netlify. I can save this, and then I can zip it up again. Let me delete the previous ones. Zip it up. And if I want to redeploy it, I can just go back to that site that I set up originally, head to the deploy section, and look at the drag and drop section over here. So I can just go over here, drag it down in here, and it's uploading and it's published. So now when I refresh, it says hello Netlify. So that's Netlify Drop. You can always access the previous deploy with a unique URL. So if you click down in here, you can access the previous deploy. And you can even roll it back. So if you want, you can just say publish deploy. And now when I refresh this original URL, and I refresh it, it goes back to the original version. Because every single deploy is immutable, so you can always roll back something if you need to. Now we don't expect you to drag and drop every time. So the next method I'm going to cover is using the Netlify CLI. This is a pretty big topic that actually deserves a separate video, but here we're only going to use the Netlify CLI to deploy. So I'm going to go back to the folder that I had, which I'm editing the file in, and I can pull up the terminal in VS Code. I already have the Netlify CLI installed, but if you need to, you can run npm install global netlify-CLI, and that will install for you. I'm running a Netlify version of 2.12. You can run Netlify status to check if you're logged in. I am. And you can run login, Netlify login, if you're not. Now I'm going to edit my HTML again to indicate that I'm deploying from the Netlify CLI. So I'm just going to say Netlify CLI rules. So we should see that if we deploy correctly. So down in here, I'm going to write Netlify deploy. For brevity, because this is a lot to type, you can actually use NTL and that would work. And we'll see what we get. So the first thing it tells me is that this folder isn't linked to a site. I have an existing site that I want to link to, but we'll avoid that for now and just create a new site, and we'll do the linking later. So we'll create and configure a new site. They'll ask you to pick your teams. It's likely that you'll just have one or two teams. So just pick the appropriate team, and then you can pick something like Netlify demo site. Now it's asking you for the deploy path. In most cases, you can just go with whatever is suggested, but we'll tell you how to configure this later. And so now it's uploaded all of these pieces of information and actually showed you what it's done, as well as given you a URL where you can actually go check it out. So here, because I've only chosen Netlify deploy, by default it deploys to a draft URL. So you can see what it looks like in production before you actually push it to master. If you're happy with this and you actually want to push it to master, just run netlify deploy -- prod. And that does exactly the same thing as Netlify deploy, but it pushes it directly, instead of a draft URL, it pushes it directly to master. So here we have a live URL. So if we click this, we should be able to see the CLI rules on the main URL instead of the draft URL. Again, remember that each of these deployments is immutable, so you can roll back to it at any time, or give this as a link to a friend or a colleague for reviewing whatever content or code changes you've been. Now notice that it keeps prompting me for a deploy path. If you want to actually just hard code that, there are a few different ways to do it, but the way that I would recommend is to create a netlify.toml file. So I'm going to exit out of this process, and I'm going to create a netlify.toml. So this is an example netlify.toml that I have just saved on my copy of my clipboard manager. We're going to comment this out for now, and we're going to focus on the published directory. So the published directory is the directory that we want to zip up and send out to the CDN of Netlify. Down in here, I usually use a dist folder, but here I'm just deploying the root folder, so we can just say dot. You can run netlify deploy prod, and I'm no longer being asked about where my publish deploy path is. Of course, I can move all of the assets into a publish folder. So something like publish, like dist, and I can move all of the assets in here. So now it looks a lot cleaner, and I can build from a source code directory. So then I would have to change my publish directory accordingly to the dist folder. So I only publish anything inside of this, and anything outside of dist does not get. And I can just run that accordingly. Now in Netlify, we actually really encourage using version control, and we call it Git-centric workflow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to initiate Git. So Git init. Now you notice one new folder that was created that I haven't explained yet is the .netlify folder. It really is just a simple little JSON file that stores where you've linked, what site you've linked the project to. So for example, if over here I run netlify status, you can actually see not just my login information, but which site this particular folder, this particular project has been linked to. So it says down here netlify site info, and it gives me all that stuff. And you can notice the site ID is an exact match of what's in state.json. So obviously this .netlify folder it's pretty helpful for Netlify CLI to understand what site you've linked to, but it may not be so helpful for an open source project, for example, where people downloading your repo might not have access to the same site, so checking that in might confuse them. However, actually checking that in for a team project is probably pretty handy so that people don't have to set up their own sites. It's really up to you, but I personally generally git ignore the Netlify folder, and it really depends on your use case whether you do that or not. So I've gone and git ignored as well. I'm going to edit the content over here so we also reflect that we're deploying from Git this time. And we'll see what happens with that. So now I can say git add dot, and git add everything, git commit, and show files. You can come up with a better message than I have. And now we have to set up a remote. Netlify works with GitLab, Bitbucket, and GitHub. Obviously, I am most familiar with GitHub, so I'm going to use that, but feel free to use whatever Git provider you care about. So, Netlify, what am I calling it? Netlify Drop site master, and just link it right here. So I can copy that URL and just say git remote add origin, and now I have that linked up. I can actually say git push origin master. So that when I refresh over here, I can see that I've pushed my site up to Git. So surprisingly, we've gone through two of the methods, and we're actually well set up to do continuous deploy to Netlify. And I'm going to show you what that looks like right now. So if we go to the Netlify homepage, these are all the sites that I have currently, but you can also click New Site from Git. You can choose to set up continuous deployment from one of these providers. Obviously, I choose GitHub. And I can select that repo that I just created. So you'll notice over here that it reads the netlify.toml file that we've made, and it's also created some other options that you might want to look into as well. We'll talk about the build command when we get to the build section. So we're just going to hit deploy site, and it really is that simple. So this deploy should be done pretty quickly, and once you click that site, you should be able to see Netlify from Git directly as pushed from our local development to GitHub, and from GitHub pulled into Netlify. Let's have a look at what continuous deployment workflow looks like. So I'm going to go over to my deploys view, and then I'm also going to go over to my project. I'm going to make some edits as well. So I'm going to say continuous deployment is the best, because it is. I'm going to git add dot again, commit change h2, and git push origin master. That's just an alias that I have set up locally. So that's going to deploy straight to GitHub, and that's going to kick off a build in here. And that's just an underlying secret about how Netlify works, is to automate this entire process. So now there's no build time, so it just basically deployed immediately. And so now when I head back to the original site, Goofy Austin 8AFF8, I can see that continuous deployment is the best. Over in GitHub, I can also refresh and see my change down in here. And that's continuous deployment, the idea that your deploys update in lockstep with your Git. Don't forget that you can always roll things back if you made a mistake or if you're not ready to release something. So for example, I can publish this old deploy, and if I head back to the site and refresh, it goes back to the original Git message. and the next version is still here. So that's how we launch some of our features. If you want to turn off continuous deployment for some reason, you can click Stop Auto Publishing, and that will stop. And now when I make some more changes, stopped auto publish, stopped. Again, this is a git alias just for me to be a little bit quicker in my actions. So now when I see this update coming in, it actually has built and deployed. It just isn't published yet. And you can see this little lock icon because I've stopped auto-publishing. So when I refresh my page, I haven't changed anything in terms of the text because I haven't published the latest update. If I want to kick it back on again, it doesn't immediately promote the latest deploy to the published site because you may not want that to happen. So you're going to have to go in here, deploy. And only then you'll see the new text that you've pushed to Git. So a lot of the secret around how this is done is basically setting up internal build hooks. You can actually set up your own build hooks down in here in the settings, and it just gives you a URL you can use to trigger a build. So let's have a look at how that works. So I can give this a name, for example, demo hook, and you can give it a branch to build. Here I only have master, but you can imagine building other branches. And you can save it. And that gives you a build hook with which to use. So now I'm going to, and there's a very useful curl command. So I can actually paste that into my. So let's head over to the deploy section, and I'm going to bring up my terminal. I copied from the build hook section. So I'm going to see that I fired this off. And now if I wait long enough or refresh, I can see that a new hook has been triggered by the demo hook. People use build hooks for all sorts of things. For example, you can go to if this then that and trigger builds on a tweet, for example. Or you can set a scheduled job from Zapier or any other cron service to build every minute, every day, every hour, whatever suits your build process. For example, one of my coworkers, Phil Hawksworth, actually built a clock, set your watch by netlify.com. This isn't a dynamically updated JavaScript clock. It literally builds every minute. So now if I refresh, you can actually see the time update accordingly. For the last method of deploying, it's more of a fun demo and not something you're likely to use more than once, but it's handy to have around, especially for open source projects. If you have a netlify.toml configured correctly, then you can also set up a one-click deploy to Netlify button that's pretty easy to get going. So I'm going to go to my GitHub directory that I've set up in the course of this video. I'm going to copy that URL. I'll head to the deploy button docs on netlify.com, and I'll just paste that in here. And that will configure various things like the Markdown snippet, HTML, and Elm snippet if you use Elm. But here I'm just going to copy a Markdown snippet. What that helps me do is paste it directly into my README. So you can say things like deploy to Netlify down in here. So I'm going to commit this again. New deploy to Netlify button. And I'll push to master. And now when I refresh, I get this nice deploy to Netlify button. So it's nice to display on your docs, especially for open source boilerplates and projects, because what that enables people to do, people who are not you, is to click that button and get that one-click deploy experience. So for example, here it says connect to GitHub. I'll give this a different name, deploy to Netlify, and it's going to set up a site and set up that continuous deployment and fork your repo, all in the process of one click. So whoever's working on their new site can get the benefits of this latest site from you, but then they also have a fork with which to start work on. So that's what the deploy to Netlify button is. It's just a streamlined process It's useful for open source boilerplate authors and app authors. So now we're done talking about ways to deploy things on Netlify. Notice that we haven't talked about build, because that's a different stage of the deploy cycle, where you may have to set the build command, and we'll come to that in a bit. But I wanted to spend some time talking about what you get by default, because these are things where there's nothing to cover because you got it by default already. But it's good to be aware of what you get for free. So the first thing to notice is that you get HTTPS by default. So that's a more encrypted protocol where you're not susceptible to man-in-the-middle attacks. And that's just a best practice for modern websites. By default, you also get deploy previews. So I'm going to do a little demo of that with our demo site. I'm going to create a new branch, a new site, new feature, for example. And I'm going to edit that in here. Awesome new feature. And I'm going to save that. And awesome feature. And pushed and git push origin new feature. And then I'm going to go create a PR on GitHub. So I've been working on a branch. I have an awesome new feature. I'll leave a comment. Please merge, create a pull request, and we'll let it perform some checks. But you can see that automatically some things happen that you may not necessarily have on a normal site. And so this is a deploy preview, basically saying that even a PR which hasn't been merged, I can actually check out over here where it says awesome new feature, and it gives me a label of deploy preview 1, and that is a preview that I can share with my clients or my coworkers. Sometimes if you're using, for example, a static site generator, you may want to check out if pages or redirects have changed. So you can click on the details, and it brings you into Netlify, where you can look at what pages have changed in particular, and that should be exactly what you expect in terms of pages. Once you're happy with your preview, you can merge it in, and that should also kick off a new build on the master branch. So that's a very nice workflow, from previewing the new feature before you merge, and then merging it in once you're happy, and having your customers see it. The third default to know about is that Netlify is a CDN by default. So all of your deploys are distributed to the nearest points of presence. This isn't documented everywhere because the list keeps changing, but as of the time of this recording, the regular free tier gets a few locations: Frankfurt, Singapore, San Francisco, New York, Sao Paulo, and Sydney. And the enterprise tier gets a few more locations. Deploys are also atomic, which means that Netlify waits until all the files are published before pushing everything to production, so that your customers never see like a half updated site, no matter when they hit. And also, it also has instant rollbacks, which means that it invalidates the cache globally whenever you do a rollback, for example, by clicking an old deploy and clicking publish deploy. So here I've rolled the version back, and now it's instantly invalidated, and I can just refresh and see that old deploy. Lastly, you also get asset optimization. Now this is not on by default, but it's so easy to turn on that I can't resist telling you about it. So if you head over to the site that we've been published and you look into the sources, you can see that we've actually not optimized this site for performance. This is obviously a super small site, so it doesn't matter, but you may want to have this on a larger site. So for example, we can minify the CSS, or also if we had any JavaScript files, we can also minify that and do a bunch of other hygienic things to clean up the way that we optimize our assets. So if we want to turn that on, head over to deploy settings and scroll down to post-processing section. And we can click on asset optimization and enable asset optimization and click save. And the last step to do in this process is to head over here and retrigger a deploy. So that will introduce asset optimization into the post-processing step. which is after you've uploaded all your files. And now, when I refresh my site, you can see that the structure of the site looks, it looks the same on the HTML side point of things, but the CSS is now minified. So this is that much faster to deliver over the wire, and it just took you a couple clicks. So we covered some nice features that you get by default. There may be others that I haven't covered. I just wanted to highlight some of these. And the last part of the deploy section is going to be about customizing the URL, the domains that your customers see. So the first thing to try is to not stick to the auto-generated ones that have been assigned to you, but just to customize what that looks like. So over here, I'm going to say something. I can go over to deploy settings, go to general, and change the site name. So over here, I can say Netlify Drop demo site master. So now when I click over here, it has a more ergonomic site name, but it is still on the .netlify.com domain. Another feature I wanted to highlight is what happens when you want to customize the internal URL architecture within your site. So for example, let's create an About Us page and have that show up. So I'm going to create about.html. Paste that in here. And I'm going to hollow out most of these features. Just call this About Us. And leave the rest pretty much like this. Okay, so now I have a new About Us page. And I'm going to change to master and commit this. New About Us page and push it to master. I can hit to About and see the About Us page. So that's all well and good until we tell people to go to the About Us page, and they might type in /AboutUs and get a 404 page. It's not found. So what do we do about that? So one of the ways we can handle this is to add in a redirects file. So there's some guides as to how to do that over here, but we'll just show you inside of code. So I'm just going to add a _redirects file, and this basically just tells you where to redirect from and to. So for example, if people type in About Us, redirect people to About. So again, I'm going to commit this, add redirects, and I'm going to push to master. So now when I head to this About Us page, it's going to redirect to About. Let's do it again. About Us. It redirects to About. So that's very handy, but sometimes people just type in any sorts of random stuff, and they just don't really get a nice experience. So it's nice to set up a custom 404 page. So let's also do that. I'm going to set up a 404.html. And not found. Okay. And I'm also going to set up a redirect that's a catch-all. So how you do a catch-all redirect is you just literally hit a star and you direct people to the 404. So if you imagine in a single page app, you might want to send people to index.html, because then the single page app might redirect people to the right area. But here we're going to send people to the 404. So now when I refresh, it actually redirects to 404 on literally any URL, except for About Us, which still works. So the redirects only run when there's no corresponding HTML or other static asset to use. For people using JavaScript and requesting JSON files, do note that sometimes you may accidentally hit a redirect and get back HTML when you actually meant to request something in JSON. So just be careful about that. and be aware that you're parsing HTML as JSON, and those will typically solve your errors. Now, of course, when you're getting your site up to production, you're probably also going to want to use a custom domain. So let's head over to Settings, head to the Domain Management section, and here's where you can configure your custom domains. Nullify offers free custom domains. That doesn't mean it buys the domain for you. But if you already have a domain bought somewhere, for example, from Google Domains or Hover, you can actually set it up to link that site together. This is something that other hosting providers charge for. So for example, I can just say whatever, search.io, that's my own site. And I can click verify. And if it's already owned by me, I can say yes, add domain. Let's see what happened. So my site already currently uses this. If it's a site that hasn't been set up, you can also set that up. If you have a domain that you want to buy, you can actually buy it through Netlify. And you can actually buy it through Netlify, and Netlify will buy it for you, and you can pay Netlify with that and to set it up for you. Here's what it looks like for my personal domain. I have a Netlify subdomain as well as a custom domain set up that's set to be the primary domain, and everything just redirects to that primary domain. I also have Netlify managed DNS, and that's what Netlify uses. And that's an extra service that Netlify provides to add extra features. But anyway, so here's how the DNS panel looks if you have a custom domain set up. You can also enable IPv6 as well as customize your DNS records and name servers. Note that you can manage all your domains on this team level on app.netlify.com/teams/your-team/DNS. So that's the end of the first part of this video. Let's have a quick recap of what's available to you with Netlify when you're deploying. There are 4 methods of deploying. We started out with Netlify's historical method, which is dragging and dropping. Then we used the CLI to do a manual deploy. Then we also linked our repo up to GitHub. Then we set up continuous deploy from GitHub so that every time you push to GitHub, you'll get a new deploy, and that is continuous deployment. And finally, we set up the deploy to Netlify button on our README so that open source project can clone our repo and deploy in one click. We also took a little look at the defaults that are provided out of the box for Netlify. We get free HTTPS, also called SSL. We also get free deploy previews, same deal. You can also get branch deploys, which I do not cover in this video, but they're kind of the same thing, just for different branches. We also talk about Netlify as a CDN, how they're distributed among various points of presence, how Netlify deploys are atomic, meaning they all deploy every single file to production at once, and as well as providing instant rollbacks from a network control angle. We also talked a little bit about turning on asset optimization. So this is not on by default, but it's pretty much one click. And unless you have some bugs that are not compatible with this, you should always have it on. Then finally, we talked about Netlify and custom domains. So most things are hosted on a custom Netlify subdomain, but sometimes you want to do redirects around what the internal URL structure of your pages are. We covered that, as well as how to do catch-alls for 404s. We also covered how to link up custom domains, as well as a little bit about Netlify DNS and how Netlify can manage a DNS for you if you choose to have it. You can also set up branch deploys for managed DNS if you're using Netlify DNS. So that's the scope of deploying on Netlify. And in other videos, we'll cover the other sections. But if you have any questions about deploying, please let me know. Cheers.